The summer of 1832 found the Ohio frontier a place where three worlds collided: the remnants of ancient tribal territories, the relentless push of American settlement, and the shadowy realm between them, where understanding could bloom or violence could erupt without warning. In the dense forests that bordered the Scioto River, where morning mist clung to moss-covered oak trees and deer paths wound through thick undergrowth, the echoes of recent conflicts still hung in the humid air like smoke from distant fires. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Treaty of Greenville had supposedly settled territorial disputes 37 years earlier, but promises made on paper carried little weight when families were starving and land was at stake. Settlers continued their westward push, while native tribes struggled to maintain their ancestral hunting grounds. Each side carried grievances, each felt wronged, and in between these opposing forces lived those who simply tried to survive without taking sides in a conflict that seemed to have no end. Rebecca Morrison had chosen this borderland existence not from political conviction, but from circumstance. At 28, she possessed the kind of practical intelligence that comes from being widowed young and forced to make one's own way in an unforgiving world. Her husband, Thomas Morrison, had fallen during a skirmish 2 years prior. Not in battle between settlers and natives, but in a senseless dispute over a missing cow that had escalated into gunfire. His death had left her with a small cabin on 40 acres of partially cleared land, 2 milk cows, a vegetable garden, and the unwavering determination never to let others' conflicts dictate her survival. The cabin stood in a small clearing where Thomas had begun his ambitious plans to establish a proper homestead. Built from local timber with a stone foundation quarried from the hillside, it represented 3 seasons of back-breaking labor. One room served multiple purposes: sleeping, cooking, eating, and the occasional medical emergency when injured. Travelers found their way to her door. A lean-to on the eastern side housed the tools and provisions that meant the difference between self-sufficiency and dependence on the distant settlement of Lancaster, a day's hard ride to the southeast. Rebecca had learned quickly that neutrality required its own kind of strength. She treated any injured party who appeared at her door, settler or native, soldier or civilian, without asking questions about the circumstances that had brought them there. This approach had earned her a reputation for fairness among the scattered families in the region, though some viewed her refusal to choose sides as dangerous naivety. She preferred to think of it as a survival strategy in a land where yesterday's ally could become tomorrow's enemy, based on nothing more than shifting territorial claims. The morning of June 15th began like countless others. Rebecca rose before dawn to tend the garden, drawing water from the well Thomas had dug their first year on the land. The corn was growing tall, and the beans showed promise of a good harvest if the weather held. She checked the trapline he had established along the creek, a necessary supplement to their diet that had become her responsibility to maintain. The milk cows, Daisy and Belle, required attention morning and evening, their rhythmic contentment a small anchor of normalcy in unpredictable times. By mid-morning, with the daily chores completed, Rebecca decided to walk the riverbank to collect wild blackberries she had spotted 2 days earlier. The Scioto ran clear and shallow in the summer months, its banks thick with berry bushes and medicinal plants she had learned to identify through necessity and careful observation. Her woven basket, made from local willow branches, according to a technique shared by an elderly settler woman, swung easily at her side as she navigated the familiar path. The forest held its usual morning chorus, birdsong mixing with the drone of insects and the occasional splash of fish breaking the water's surface. Rebecca moved quietly, her moccasin-style boots making minimal noise on the soft earth. Thomas had taught her the importance of moving silently in the woods, not from paranoia, but from practical awareness that understanding one's surroundings meant blending into them rather than announcing one's presence. She had filled half her basket when she heard it, not a sound exactly, but rather the absence of sound that often signaled something unusual. The birds had gone silent in a radius around some disturbance downstream. Rebecca froze, listening intently while her mind calculated possibilities. Bear? Unlikely, given the time of day. Human presence? More probable, though it could be anything. From fellow berry pickers to something more concerning, moving carefully toward the sound, or rather the source of the silence. Rebecca used the larger trees for cover while maintaining a clear view of the riverbank ahead. What she saw there drove all thoughts of berries from her mind. A child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, lay partially in the water where the current had apparently deposited him. His clothing, what remained of it, marked him as Shawnee. The geometric patterns and particular style of beadwork were distinct even at a distance. The child wasn't moving. Dark stains on his torn shirt indicated blood, and his position suggested he had crawled to the water's edge before collapsing. Rebecca's medical experience, limited but practical, kicked in immediately. She had treated enough injuries on the frontier to recognize urgency when she saw it. The child needed help, and he needed it now. Without hesitation, she splashed into the shallow water. The cold shocked her system, but she barely noticed as she reached the boy and turned him onto his back. His face, though peaceful in unconsciousness, showed the distinctive features of the tribes who had once dominated this entire region. High cheekbones, strong jaw, copper skin that would have been richly colored if not for the pallor of blood. Loss, multiple wounds marked his small body. A deep gash across his ribs looked like it had come from a knife or tomahawk. Smaller cuts on his arms and legs suggested he had fled through thick brush, possibly for hours or even days before reaching the river. What struck Rebecca most forcefully was his age. He couldn't be more than 8 years old, alone in the wilderness, gravely injured and still clinging to life. She pressed her fingers to his neck, searching for a pulse. There, weak but present, the child lived, but barely. Rebecca's mind raced through her limited options. Leaving him here meant certain death. Taking him to the cabin meant involving herself in whatever conflict had led to his injuries. The smart choice, the safe choice, would be to alert the authorities in Lancaster and let them handle what was clearly a delicate situation involving tribal politics. Instead, Rebecca Morrison made a decision that would irrevocably alter the course of her life. She gathered the unconscious child in her arms, surprised by how light he felt, despite his apparent age. The various wounds reopened with movement, fresh blood staining her dress, but she couldn't worry about that now. The cabin was only a quarter-mile upstream, but carrying an injured child through the forest would require every ounce of her strength. The journey back proved more challenging than anticipated. What had been an easy walk downriver became an exhausting struggle upstream. The child's dead weight shifted constantly, forcing Rebecca to readjust her grip multiple times. Her arms burned with effort, and sweat soaked through her dress despite the morning coolness. More concerning was the steady drip of blood that marked their path. If anyone came looking for the boy, they would have no difficulty following the trail directly to her door. Several times she had to pause, repositioning the child to maintain her grip while catching her breath. During these moments, she examined his injuries more closely. The deep cut across his ribs appeared to be the most serious, though it had mostly stopped bleeding. The numerous smaller wounds suggested he had fallen into brambles or been deliberately punished. She couldn't determine which. His clothing, torn and blood-stained, told a story of desperate flight through unforgiving terrain. When Rebecca finally reached the cabin clearing, her strength was nearly depleted. She kicked open the door, latched to keep out wildlife during her absence, and carried the child directly to her sleeping area. The straw-stuffed mattress would do for now. Proper medical care demanded immediate attention over comfort considerations. Working quickly, she assessed the situation with the methodical approach that had served her well during previous medical emergencies. First, she needed to stop any active bleeding. Second, clean the wounds to prevent infection. Third, determine what additional injuries might be present but not immediately visible. The process demanded total focus, pushing aside questions about the child's origins or the circumstances that had brought him to her river. Rebecca kept a small supply of medical materials, clean cloths, needle and thread for stitching, basics, herbs for pain relief and healing. Thomas had insisted on maintaining such supplies, knowing that medical help could be days away when needed. She had built upon his provisions over the past 2 years, learning which local plants offered healing properties and how to preserve them for emergencies exactly like this one. Heating water over the fire, she began the careful process of cleaning each wound. The child remained unconscious throughout, his breathing shallow but steady. The deep cut along his ribs would require stitching. Not a pleasant task, but a necessary one if he was to survive. Rebecca had sewn up injuries before, on both humans and animals, but never on a child so young or so gravely hurt. As she worked, questions multiplied in her mind. Who was this boy? Why had he been alone in the forest? What violence had he been fleeing? Most importantly, what would happen when his people came looking for him, as they surely would? The Shawnee were known for their strong family bonds and tribal loyalty. A missing child would trigger a search, and that search would eventually lead to her cabin. The afternoon sun slanted through the single window as Rebecca completed the most urgent medical care. The child's wounds were cleaned and bandaged, the serious gash stitched closed, with small, careful stitches that would leave minimal scarring if they were held. She had managed to get some willow bark tea between his lips, a mild pain reliever that might help if he regained consciousness. Now there came the waiting. The child needed rest, proper food when he could manage it, and time for his body to begin healing. Rebecca settled into the routine maintenance of her unexpected patient, checking his breathing, adjusting bandages, and monitoring for signs of fever that would indicate infection. She prepared a thin broth from dried venison and herbs, knowing that when he woke, his body would need easily digestible nourishment. As evening approached, the reality of her situation crystallized. She had committed herself to caring for this child, but doing so carried enormous risks. White settlers who discovered she was harboring an Indian child might view her actions as betrayal. The Shawnee, when they found their missing boy, might see her as a kidnapper rather than savior. In a region where trust was rare and misunderstandings deadly, Rebecca had placed herself directly between two potentially hostile forces. Yet, looking at the small, injured boy who breathed steadily on her bed, she couldn't regret her decision. Whatever conflicts raged in the wider world, whatever grievances existed between peoples, this child had needed help. That basic human truth trumped all political considerations. She would nurse him back to health, and when he was strong enough, help him return to his people. The consequences of that choice would have to be faced when they arose. Night fell quietly around the cabin. Rebecca maintained her vigil, periodically checking on her patient while trying to prepare herself for what might come. She cleaned and loaded Thomas's rifle, not with aggressive intent, but with the understanding that unpredictable situations demanded readiness. Her medical supplies were organized for easy access. Extra water was drawn from the well. These practical preparations helped calm her nerves, while acknowledging the reality that her isolated cabin had suddenly become the center of a potentially volatile situation. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Outside, the forest night sounds resumed their normal patterns, owls calling small, creatures rustling through undergrowth, the distant howl of wolves. But Rebecca listened with heightened awareness now, knowing that among these familiar sounds could hide the approach of either friend or foe. The child's people would be searching. How long before they found the trail of blood leading directly to her door? The boy stirred slightly around midnight, a soft moan escaping his lips. Rebecca moved quickly to his side, checking his pulse and temperature. The fever she had feared was beginning. His skin felt warm, though not dangerously so. She prepared a cool compress for his forehead and adjusted his position to make breathing easier. When his eyes fluttered open briefly, meeting hers with confused terror before closing again, Rebecca spoke softly in what little Shawnee she had learned through interaction with peaceful traders. "Rest now. You are safe here. I mean no harm." Whether the child understood her words or simply registered the gentle tone, his body relaxed slightly. The moment passed quickly, consciousness slipping away again like a fish returning to deep water. Rebecca resumed her watch, but something had changed. This was no longer just an injured stranger in her care. This was a specific child with eyes that held their own story, pain, and perhaps the first fragile seeds of trust. The night stretched on, measured in careful attention to breathing, periodic checking of bandages, and the growing awareness that dawn would bring challenges she could only begin to imagine. Rebecca Morrison had lived on the frontier long enough to know that some decisions, once made, create their own momentum. She had chosen to save a life, and now she would face whatever consequences that choice might bring. As the first light of dawn began to pale the eastern sky, she made another decision. Whatever happened with the tribe, whatever official response her actions might trigger, she would see this through to its conclusion. The boy would heal under her care, or she would do everything in her power to ensure he did. Politics, prejudice, and fear would not dictate the basic human responsibility she had accepted. This was how Rebecca Morrison found herself at the center of a situation that would test everything she believed about justice, compassion, and survival on a frontier where every choice carried the weight of life or death. The second day brought confirmation of Rebecca's worst fears, while revealing unexpected truths about her young patient. Dawn broke grey and humid, the kind of weather that presaged afternoon thunderstorms. She had managed only fitful sleep in the chair beside the bed, jerking awake at every small sound from the child or perceived noise from the forest beyond her cabin walls. The boy had survived the night, but his condition remained precarious. The fever had settled into a pattern, rising dangerously in the late-night hours before breaking into sweats near dawn. Rebecca had learned to anticipate these cycles during her 2 years of frontier medicine, but treating a child carried different anxieties than tending to adult injuries. Children could deteriorate rapidly, their smaller bodies lacking the reserves to fight prolonged illness. As morning light strengthened, she assessed the bandages with cautious optimism. No signs of serious infection had developed overnight, though. Several wounds showed the angry redness that preceded either healing or festering. The deep cut along his ribs had stopped seeping blood, the stitches holding despite his restless movements during fevered sleep. What concerned her more than the physical wounds were the psychological ones she couldn't see. During his moments of semi-consciousness, the boy had reacted with pure terror to any sudden movement or sound. His small hands would clench into fists, eyes darting frantically around the unfamiliar cabin before exhaustion dragged him back under. Rebecca recognized trauma when she saw it, a response burned into his young nervous system by experiences too terrible for a child to endure. She prepared fresh willow bark tea, and managed to get more liquid into him using a method she had learned for tending injured animals, allowing drops to fall between partially opened lips rather than forcing him to drink. Dehydration killed as surely as infection on the frontier, and maintaining adequate fluids was crucial for any healing process. By mid-morning, as Rebecca worked in her garden while keeping the cabin door open to monitor her patient, she noticed the first signs that her actions hadn't gone unobserved. Birds along the forest edge exhibited unusual behavior, flying in agitated patterns rather than their normal territorial routes. Small creatures that typically foraged near her clearing had vanished entirely. The forest was adjusting to the presence of human watchers, unseen but definitely there. Rebecca continued her normal daily routine with deliberate visibility. Anyone observing would see her tending her vegetables, feeding the chickens, milking the cows. She made no effort to hide her presence or activities. If scouts were already positioned around her property, as seemed increasingly likely, any attempt at concealment would only increase suspicion. Better to demonstrate that life continued normally, while hoping they weren't yet aware of the child inside her cabin. The deception couldn't last. Around noon, as she prepared a proper broth for the boy's next meal, she heard him cry out, not the moans of fever or pain she had grown accustomed to, but actual words in the Shawnee language. He was awake and aware, calling for someone. His mother, based on the tone and repetition. Rebecca approached the bed cautiously. The boy's eyes tracked her movements now, no longer glazed with fever, but sharp with intelligence and wariness. When she offered the cup of broth, he recoiled initially before thirst overrode caution. He drank deeply, watching her over the rim of the cup, with eyes that seemed too knowing for his apparent age. Communication proved challenging. Rebecca's Shawnee vocabulary extended to perhaps 20 words, basic trading terms and simple courtesies picked up from peaceful interactions. Over the years, the boy seemed to understand more English than she knew of his language, but fear kept him largely silent. Through gestures and the few words they shared, Rebecca learned his name was Kokosi, which meant little star in Shawnee. He appeared to be 7 or 8 as she had estimated, though malnutrition might have affected his growth. When she pointed to his injuries and mimed asking what had happened, his face closed completely. Whatever had brought him to her river had traumatized him beyond his ability to discuss, at least with a white stranger. The afternoon brought new complications. While checking the perimeter of her property during her normal daily routine, Rebecca discovered unmistakable signs of recent presence, broken twigs at specific heights, scuff marks in the soil arranged in patterns no animal would create, and most tellingly, a small pile of stones that definitely hadn't been there the previous day. Shawnee scouts had found them. The arrangements of these signs suggested they were marking boundaries, tracking movement patterns, and possibly preparing for something more substantial than passive observation. Rebecca's cabin had become the center of a developing situation involving a lost child and his people who had every right to be suspicious of any white settlers' intentions. By late afternoon, the first obvious contact occurred. Rebecca was drawing water from the well when she noticed a figure at the forest edge, visible briefly, purposefully, before melting back into the trees. The message was clear. They could approach whenever they chose. They were announcing their presence rather than maintaining stealth, which suggested they wanted communication rather than immediate confrontation. The boy's condition continued improving throughout the day. He managed to keep down solid food, small pieces of cornbread soaked in broth, and showed more alertness during waking periods. But his trauma responses hadn't diminished. Any unexpected sound sent him scrambling to cover himself with blankets, and he flinched at anything approaching too quickly near his face. As evening approached, Rebecca made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. She opened the cabin door wider than usual and began preparing a meal obviously intended for more than one person. She set out 2 tin plates, 2 cups, and arranged food portions that exceeded what she and the boy could consume. If the scouts were going to take action, better to invite controlled contact than wait for circumstances to force their hand. The invitation was answered as darkness fell, not dramatically with sudden appearance, but gradually as shapes resolved from shadows near her doorway. 2 Shawnee warriors, one older with grey threading his dark hair, one younger but carrying the bearing of established authority, stepped into the circle of light cast by her open door. Rebecca had prepared herself emotionally for this moment, but seeing these men, armed and potentially hostile, standing in her cabin's threshold made her heart race despite her outward calm. She gestured to the prepared places at her table, using the few Shawnee words she knew to offer food and water. The universal language of hospitality, hoping it would bridge the gap between their cultures and concerns. The older warrior spoke first, his English heavily accented but clear enough. "The boy, where?" His eyes swept the cabin's interior before settling on Rebecca with intensity that demanded truth. She pointed to the bed area, partially screened by a hanging cloth. "Injured, healing." She mimed drinking and eating to indicate care rather than captivity, then pointed to the bandages visible on one of his arms to show medical attention. The younger warrior moved toward the bed, and Rebecca had to force herself not to interfere. When he lifted the cloth divider and spoke softly in Shawnee, Kokosi's response, a child's voice bright with recognition and relief, broke whatever tension had been building. Not captivity, reunion. What followed altered Rebecca's understanding of her situation completely. The older warrior, who introduced himself as Wapashuwuk, meaning white bear, slowly, carefully explained what young Kokose had fled. 3 days earlier, a raiding party had attacked the boys' village, not in open warfare, but a targeted strike designed to capture children for the slave markets that still operated despite official prohibitions. The raiders hadn't been settlers or soldiers, but rather a mixed group, including some tribal members from rival clans motivated by the increasing value of young captives in certain southern markets. Kokosi had escaped during the raid, though several other children had been taken. His injuries came not just from fleeing through the forest, but from actively being chased. The knife wound across his ribs was from a raider who had nearly recaptured him. The boy had run for 2 days, following water sources south, before collapsing by the Scioto where Rebecca had found him. Wapashuwuk's steady gaze assessed Rebecca as he shared this information. The story explained so much: the child's terror, his inability to discuss what had happened, the careful scouting that had preceded this meeting. His tribe weren't searching for a lost child, they were tracking escaped captives and the raiders, who had taken them, while simultaneously seeking the boy whose trail had led to a white settler's cabin. "You help him," the older warrior stated, not a question but an acknowledgement. "This is not usual. White settlers often—" He paused, choosing words carefully. "White settlers often see advantage in trading children." The implication hung heavy. Rebecca's actions had been exceptional in a context where tribal children held market value to unscrupulous traders. The revelation reframed everything. Rebecca wasn't simply caught between abstract political forces, but had inadvertently inserted herself into an active human trafficking situation. The raiders who had attacked Kokosi's village were likely still active in the region, possibly seeking the boy specifically since he represented both valuable merchandise and a witness to their crimes. As if summoned by this thought, the evening's relative calm shattered. From outside came the sound of horses, multiple riders approaching at speed rather than stealth. The two warriors reacted instantly, weapons drawn, positioning themselves defensively between the door and the bed where Kokosi still lay vulnerable. Rebecca grabbed Thomas's rifle from above the fireplace, her earlier preparations proving eerily prescient. Through the cabin's single window, torchlights bobbed erratically, the kind of illumination used for tracking rather than peaceful travel. Someone had followed the same trail she had, finding first the blood along the riverbank and then the carefully marked path leading directly to her clearing. The approaching riders made no attempt at discretion. Their calls echoed through the forest, English mixed with commands in various languages, including tribal dialects. These were the raiders Wapashuwuk had described, arriving to reclaim what they considered valuable lost property. What happened next would test every assumption Rebecca held about frontier justice, tribal politics, and her own capacity for defending. What she had chosen to protect, the isolation that had defined her life for 2 years, was about to transform into the epicenter of a conflict where the stakes extended far beyond her personal safety. The boy who had saved became the catalyst for a confrontation between different definitions of law, ownership, and humanity. Rebecca Morrison, who had simply wanted to help an injured child, now stood as the final barrier between raiders motivated by profit and warriors defending their people's children. The horses were close now, perhaps 100 yards from her clearing. Voices carried clearly in the still air. Rough men discussing strategy, debating approaches, mentioning prices that made Rebecca's blood run cold. These weren't soldiers following military orders or settlers protecting their claims. These were predators who trafficked in human lives, and they had come to collect what they considered theirs. Inside the cabin, an unlikely alliance had formed. Rebecca, still gripping her rifle, looked at Wapashuwuk and the younger warrior whose name she hadn't learned. Their earlier wariness of her had transformed into shared purpose. Between them lay an injured child, whose value to the raiders made him the center of imminent violence. "How many?" Rebecca asked quietly, checking her rifles loading for the second time. "6 horses," the younger warrior responded in precise English that surprised her. "Maybe 7 men. They carry torches because they do not know the land well. Advantage goes to those who understand the territory." Wapashuwuk added, "They seek the boy for their markets, but they will kill all who stand between them and profit. You understand this danger?" Rebecca nodded, her mouth dry but her resolve steady. She understood exactly what defending Kokosi meant. The cabin's isolated position, which had always provided peaceful solitude, now became a tactical consideration. Multiple exit points, clear firing lanes, and knowledge of the surrounding terrain, elements that might determine survival in the next hour. The riders had reached the edge of her clearing. Through chinks in the log walls, Rebecca could see shapes moving in the darkness beyond her torchlight. They were spreading out, surrounding the cabin with practiced efficiency. Professional tactics for a criminal enterprise, a voice called from the darkness, attempting authority it didn't possess. "Send out the boy, and nobody needs to get hurt. We know he's in there. We tracked him from the river. Fair warning, this is business, nothing personal." Rebecca looked at Wapashuwuk, waiting for his leadership in a situation where cultural knowledge outweighed her frontier experience. The older warrior's expression had hardened into something she recognized from stories of tribal warfare. Absolute commitment to protecting children, regardless of personal cost. "They lie," he said simply. "Dead witnesses tell no tales. They must kill all who have seen the boy, seen them. You have chosen your path by helping Kokosi. Now we choose whether we fight here or die here." The younger warrior took position at the window while Wapashuwuk moved to the door. Rebecca realized, with sudden clarity, that whatever happened next would irrevocably change her relationship with both the white settlement and tribal communities. Her quiet neutrality carefully maintained through 2 years of frontier life, was ending in a cabin surrounded by men who made their living selling children into bondage. Kokosei, despite his injuries and fever, had somehow found his way to a corner where a loaded pistol waited, Thomas's old cavalry piece that Rebecca had kept cleaned but never expected to fire. The child's ability to assess tactical necessities, even in his weakened state, spoke to training that suggested these. Village raids were not isolated incidents. The cabin fell silent, except for breathing and the sound of weapons being prepared. Outside, the raiders completed their encirclement. Rebecca realized with strange detachment that she had crossed more than geographical boundaries by settling in this borderland. She had moved beyond the safety of clear allegiances into a space where survival depended on choices made moment by moment, relationship by relationship. The boy she had pulled from the river was about to cost her everything, or everything she thought she had valued. But as Rebecca took her position at the second window, checking sight lines across her familiar yard, now filling with hostile men, she felt something unexpected, not fear, though that existed, but righteous purpose. Some lines once drawn must be defended regardless of consequences. The siege of Rebecca Morrison's cabin was about to begin, with 3 defenders, 1 injured child, and raiders who had come to claim both the boy and anyone foolish enough to stand with him. The frontier had taught her many lessons about survival, but this night would test them all in a scenario that reduced morality to its most basic element: protect the innocent or die trying. 3 worlds that had coexisted uneasily. White settlement, tribal territory, and criminal enterprise were about to collide violently around a single cabin where a woman had made the simple choice to save an injured child. The consequences of compassion were about to be written in gunpowder and determination. The first shot exploded the cabin's fragile equilibrium like a thunderclap on a clear day. It came not from the raiders, but from young Kokosei, Thomas's old cavalry pistol bucking in his small hands as he fired through a gap in the log chinking. The shot went wide, but its message rang clear across the clearing. This cabin held no helpless captives, but people prepared to fight. The raiders' response was immediate and devastating. Multiple muzzle flashes lit the darkness as return fire impeppered the cabin walls. Wood splinters exploded inward, and Rebecca dove behind the heavy oak table Thomas had built their first autumn, dragging Kokosei with her. The air filled with acrid gunpowder smoke and the whine of lead balls embedding in timber. "Cover the door!" Wapashuwok shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos as he dropped 2 attackers rushing the entrance with precise shots from behind. The door frame. The younger warrior, whose name Rebecca learned was Meekist, Standing Bear, maintained deadly calm at the window, picking his targets with the patience of a practiced hunter. Rebecca's hands shook as she reloaded her rifle, muscle memory from Thomas's insistent lessons overriding the terror that made her heart race. She had never shot at another human being, but as a raider's face appeared at her window, torch in one hand and knife in the other, that distinction evaporated like morning mist. Her shot took him high in the shoulder, spinning him backwards. Not fatal, but sufficient to send him stumbling. The metallic taste of fear filled her mouth as she frantically worked powder and ball into position for another shot. This was hell made manifest. Violence that escalated beyond any frontier conflict she had witnessed, all centered on the protection of one small boy who reloaded his pistol with surprising competence despite hands that trembled with fever. Fire. "In the barn," Meekist reported tersely, gesturing toward the window. Orange light flickered beyond the main clearing, where Rebecca's hay storage and grain supplies represented months of careful accumulation. The raiders weren't simply seeking capture anymore. They were implementing destruction to smoke out their quarry or punish resistance. Wapashuwak's response revealed sophisticated tactical thinking. Let it burn. The light will expose them when they advance. Watch the shadows. Indeed, the growing fire created a hellish illumination that transformed the battlefield. Raiders who had used darkness for cover now moved across ground lit by their own arson. Rebecca counted at least 6 distinct figures, though smoke and chaos made precise assessment impossible. A cry from outside, not of attack but of fear, drew their attention. A new element had entered the conflict. Over the crack of gunfire came sounds unmistakable to anyone who had lived in wolf country. The liquid howls that preceded a pack hunt. The forest around the cabin was responding to the violence with predatory interest. The wolf pack from Pine Ridge, Mikist observed grimly. Fire and gunshots have awakened them. They scent blood and confusion. This development fundamentally altered the tactical equation. The raiders, already pressured by more effective resistance than anticipated, now faced the possibility of becoming prey themselves. Shouts of concern replaced coordinated attack commands as men who trafficked in human suffering confronted the indifferent savagery of actual predators. Rebecca used this distraction to reassess their position. Ammunition was already running low. Frontier cabins rarely stocked for sustained firefights. She counted 12 shots remaining for her rifle, perhaps 20 for the combined pistols, and whatever Wapashuwak and Mikist carried. Not enough for a prolonged siege. We need to move the boy, she declared, surprising herself with the authoritative tone. This cabin becomes a trap if they regain coordination or bring up more men. Wapashuwak nodded slowly, respect evident in his expression. The woman speaks wisdom, but Kokosi cannot travel far with his injuries. The root cellar, Rebecca suggested. Thomas built it with a hidden exit tunnel leading to the creek. We can defend one position while moving him to safety through the other. The plan crystallized with desperate clarity. Create a diversion at the front while extracting Kokosi through the seldom-used escape route Thomas had insisted on during construction. His borderland paranoia finally justified. Mikist covered their movement as Rebecca and Wapashuwak half-carried the protesting boy toward the trapdoor concealed beneath Rebecca's rug. Kokosi, despite his fever and injuries, seemed to understand the gravity of their situation. He bit back cries of pain as movement aggravated his wounds, but maintained the discipline that marked him as a warrior's son. The root cellar lay 8 feet below ground level, accessed by a narrow ladder. Its walls, dry-laid stone with timber, supports had preserved food through 2 winters and now offered sanctuary in a different season. The escape tunnel stretched 20 yards, emerging near the creek bank where thick undergrowth provided natural concealment. "I'll go first," Mikist volunteered. "Clear the exit and establish position." His willingness to venture alone into the tunnel, not knowing what might emerge at the other end, demonstrated trust in Rebecca that hadn't existed mere hours earlier. Above them, the cabin continued taking fire. Rebecca heard furniture splintering, glass breaking, and the distinctive sound of raiders attempting to tear away the door's iron hinges. The cabin that had sheltered 2 years of grief and slow healing was being systematically destroyed in service of men who measured children's worth in currency. "Your husband was a wise man," Wapashuwak commented as they eased Kokosi toward the tunnel entrance. "Not many settlers think like warriors about all possibilities." "He learned from experience," Rebecca replied grimly. "Said if you lived between 2 worlds, you needed escape routes to both." The irony struck her forcefully. Thomas had built this tunnel anticipating potential threats from either direction, angry settlers or hostile raiders. He had never envisioned its use in defending a Shawnee child alongside tribal warriors against human traffickers, but his foresight would now save lives he couldn't have imagined protecting. Kokosi disappeared into the tunnel, followed by Wapashuwak who moved with surprising agility despite his age. Rebecca paused at the entrance, looking back at the cabin that had become home, now lit by orange flame from outside and blue gunpowder smoke within. Everything she owned existed within these walls, yet the decision to abandon them felt absolutely right. Before descending, she made one final choice that would define her relationship with both white settlement and tribal communities. Grabbing a burning piece of kindling from the fireplace, she touched it to the bag of gunpowder Thomas had stockpiled. Not to kill, the explosion would occur after they had cleared the tunnel, but to signal. Every settler within 5 miles would recognize the sound of a powder explosion. Some would come investigating. More importantly, it would mark the end of Rebecca Morrison as the quiet widow at the river's edge and announce her transformation into something the frontier's rigid social structure couldn't easily categorize. The tunnel was tight, dark, and seemed to stretch endlessly. Rebecca crawled behind Wapashuwuk, trying to support Kokosi's weight while maintaining silence. Behind them, the raid continued, but muffled now by earth and distance. Ahead lay unknown challenges. The creek at night with pursuers potentially aware of their route, open ground between concealment points, and the question of destination once immediate escape was achieved. They emerged into darkness, punctuated by starlight. The creek gurgled nearby, masking small sounds while providing orientation. Mikist materialized from shadows, having secured the immediate area and identified the safest route toward deeper forest cover. The wolves circle wider now, he reported quietly. The raiders have lost men to panic and poor positioning. Some have fled, others maintain a siege on an empty cabin. As if summoned by his words, the explosion Rebecca had engineered lit the night sky. The boom echoed across the valley, followed by secondary pops as stored ammunition ignited. The burning cabin became a beacon and funeral pyre simultaneously. End of one life, announcement of another. They will not expect pursuit, Wapashuwuk observed, watching flames consume the structure they had just evacuated. Survivors will assume we died inside. But Rebecca's mind had moved beyond immediate tactical concerns. The explosion had been a declaration of independence from the convenient myths both communities told themselves about frontier life. She had crossed a line as definitive as any geographical boundary, and there was no crossing back. As they moved into deeper forest, carrying Kokosi toward destinations still undetermined, Rebecca realized the raid had accomplished the opposite of its intention. Instead of capturing one child for market, it had forged an alliance that transcended the racial and cultural divisions dominating frontier politics. The raiders had come for a commodity and discovered resistance. They had approached, expecting weakness, and encountered coordinated defense. Most significantly, they had violated the unwritten codes of frontier survival, leaving women to fight their battles and trafficking in children, and now faced consequences extending beyond their criminal enterprise. Behind them, wolves moved through the chaos around the burning cabin, drawn by weakened prey and the breakdown of human authority. Nature's justice, Rebecca thought grimly, for those who had mistaken survival for subjugation. The small group moved steadily through, a terrain that challenged even experienced travelers. Kokosi's condition remained precarious, but necessity drove them forward. Each step took them deeper into territory where different rules applied. Not the formal boundaries drawn by governments, but the organic borders established by those who lived between worlds. The fort at Limestone Creek, Mikist suggested, as they paused for rest. 2 days' travel, but they maintain a neutral stance. Both white traders and tribal representatives gather there for business. Wapashuwuk considered this carefully. The boy needs medical attention beyond what we can provide in the forest. Fort would have supplies, perhaps a medicine man, certainly protection while healing continues. Rebecca nodded. Though the suggestion carried implications she was only beginning to understand. Limestone Creek Fort represented more than medical necessity. It symbolized entrance into a different social structure where her choices might be judged differently, but would certainly be scrutinized. The decision was interrupted by a sound that made them all freeze, hoofbeats approaching from the direction of the cabin, but measured rather than panicked. Not raiders fleeing disaster, but someone investigating the explosion with purpose and confidence. 3 horses, Wapashuwak assessed. Moving carefully, could be settlers responding to signals, could be survivors from a raid attempting recovery. They had nowhere to hide, carrying an injured child. The creek offered concealment, but no escape route if cornered. Open ground provided movement, but left them vulnerable to tracking. Every choice carried risk, but remaining stationary guaranteed eventual discovery. Rebecca made another decision that surprised her with its certainty. We don't run, we identify who's coming and react accordingly. If they're settlers from the valley, I'll intercept and explain. If they're raiders, we fight from position rather than being hunted across open ground. Both warriors studied her with new respect. Tactical wisdom from someone they had initially viewed as simply another settler, demonstrated how quickly the crisis revealed character. The widow who had pulled an injured child from river water now discussed warfare strategy with seasoned fighters as an equal. The hoofbeats grew closer, accompanied by voices Rebecca recognized. James Whitmore and his 2 brothers from the northern settlement, men known for fairness, despite their sometimes gruff manner. Not raiders seeking revenge, but neighbors responding to distress they had heard from their own cabins. That's Whitmore, Rebecca announced with relief. If we're careful, this could solve multiple problems. The night's violence had transformed her understanding of the frontier community. Isolation offered safety, but limited resources. Alliance across traditional boundaries provided protection, but demanded trust, previously unimaginable. The approaching settlers represented a third option, engagement with her own cultural community from a position of expanded perspective. What emerged from the forest wasn't the desperate widow seeking help, but a woman who had fought successfully, alongside former enemies, to protect an innocent child from those who would treat human lives as merchandise. The burned cabin behind them told part of that story. The injured Shawnee boy in her care told another, as James Whitmore's familiar voice called out cautiously in the darkness. Rebecca stepped forward to bridge worlds that had existed in parallel too long. The consequences of her riverside discovery were expanding beyond personal crisis into something that might reshape how communities understood their obligations to each other. The raid was over, but the transformation had just begun. "Hello, the woods!" Rebecca called out, using the traditional frontier greeting. "Rebecca Morrison here with company. Approach slowly, we've had raiders tonight." The hoofbeats paused, followed by muffled consultation. Then James Whitmore's voice, tentative but curious. "Rebecca, that's your place burning, isn't it? We heard shots, then the explosion. Thought you might need help." As the 3 Whitmore brothers emerged into the starlight, leading their horses cautiously, Rebecca realized she was about to test the very boundaries she had just crossed. These men had known her as Thomas's quiet widow, someone who kept to herself and caused no trouble. Now she stood beside armed Shawnee warriors, carrying a tribal child, fresh from battle with human traffickers. "Lost the cabin," she confirmed, simply noting how their eyes tracked from her burned clothes to the warriors flanking her. "Men came for the boy I've been tending. Shawnee child I found injured by the river 3 days ago. They weren't interested in a peaceful resolution." The Ija middle Whitmore brother Daniel squinted through the darkness. "That's Wapashuwak, White Bear. We've met at trading assemblies." His voice carried respect rather than hostility. "Thought the child-stealing gangs were moving further west." Wapashuwak stepped forward slightly, acknowledging the recognition. The raids follow profit wherever children can be found. Tonight, they discovered that not all settlers look the other way when innocents are threatened. The exchange revealed something Rebecca hadn't expected: existing relationships between reasonable members of both communities. The frontier's real social networks operated far more complexly than official boundaries suggested. "The boy needs medical attention," she continued, gesturing to where Kokosi remained supported by Mikist. "We'd planned to head for Limestone Creek Fort, but it's 2 days' travel, and he's already pushed beyond his limits tonight." The eldest Whitmore, Thomas, dismounted thoughtfully. "My Millicent runs a sick house at our place. Nothing official, but she's tended more fevers and wounds than most doctors back east. It's only 6 miles northeast. Good road most of the way." The offer hung in the air, carrying implications that extended beyond immediate practical assistance. Accepting meant bringing Shawnee warriors into a white settlement, testing community tolerance. Refusing might doom Kokosi to inadequate care. During critical healing time, the Whitmore settlement, Wapashuwok mused, known for fair trading, for honoring agreements made in good faith. Perhaps, he paused, considering, perhaps this night's events suggest new possibilities for cooperation against common threats. As if responding to the delicate negotiations, wolves howled closer than before. The pack had completed their investigation of the burning cabin site, and now tracked the scent trail of wounded prey. The sound reminded everyone that abstract political concerns mattered less than immediate survival. "Decide quickly," Daniel urged, glancing nervously toward the wolf sounds. "Those aren't the regular river wolves. Something stirred up the Highland pack, and they're bolder than usual this summer." Rebecca looked at her unlikely companions. Warriors she'd met hours ago now consulted as equals, settlers offering aid despite obvious social complications, and an injured child whose fate had become the nexus of rapidly shifting alliances. The isolation that had defined her world was dissolving, replaced by interconnections she couldn't have imagined when she'd pulled Kokosi from the river. "We accept your offer," she decided. "The boy needs whatever help Millicent can provide. As for the other implications," she gestured to encompass the mixed group, "tonight has already redefined what's possible. We'll face tomorrow's challenges when they arrive." The journey to Whitmore settlement unfolded with surprising cohesion. Kokosi, barely conscious but occasionally murmuring in Shawnee, was secured on Thomas Whitmore's horse, with Rebecca riding behind to support him. The warriors moved as mounted scouts, ranging ahead to check for both raiders who might have escaped the cabin siege, and wolves growing increasingly bold in their pursuit. As they traveled, James Whitmore shared information that contextualized the night's events within larger patterns. "We've heard reports from 3 other settlements in the past month. Children going missing, families finding tracks that suggest coordinated raids rather than opportunistic crime. The territorial governor claims it's isolated incidents, but traders from Kentucky tell different stories. The network is larger than local raiding parties," Wapashuwok confirmed grimly. "Some tribal members have been corrupted by the prophets, working with white criminals, and even some who claim official authority. The disease of treating humans as property spreads when left unchallenged." This conversation revealed how thoroughly the frontier's official narratives failed to capture current reality. While governments debated territorial boundaries and treaty obligations, a shadow economy in human trafficking operated with increasing boldness across all official jurisdictions. "Tonight changes things," Mikist observed. "Successful resistance to a raiding party, cooperation between white settlers and Shawnee warriors, evidence of the actual enemy. This story will travel across the territory." Rebecca listened to these broader implications while monitoring Kokosi's condition. The boy's breathing remained steady, but his fever created periods of delirium where he spoke rapidly in Shawnee, sometimes crying out names that probably belonged. To family members whose fates remained unknown, the Whitmore settlement appeared as a cluster of lights around a central clearing, more substantial than Rebecca had expected. A dozen cabins arranged defensively, with shared facilities that suggested cooperation beyond typical isolated homesteading. As their mixed party approached, figures emerged from various buildings. Word of unusual nighttime travelers had clearly spread quickly. "That's my Millicent," Thomas Whitmore indicated, pointing to a sturdy woman who strode purposefully from the largest cabin. "She's tended everyone in 3 settlements, learned from her grandmother, who learned from tribal healers." Back in Pennsylvania, Millicent Whitmore's assessment of the situation was immediate and practical. One glance at Kokosee, quick eye contact with her husband, and a nod to the 2 Shawnee warriors established priority without wasted words. "Cabin 3 is empty and prepared for sick folk. Bring the child there. I'll need boiled water, clean, cloths, and someone who speaks his language for when he's more coherent." The efficiency of her commands and the settlement's smooth response revealed an organization that extended beyond frontier survival into genuine community infrastructure. Rebecca found herself simultaneously grateful and slightly overwhelmed by the contrast with her isolated existence. As they moved Kokosee into the designated healing cabin, more settlers emerged to offer assistance. Rebecca began recognizing a pattern that challenged her assumptions about frontier social dynamics. This community had clearly developed protocols for crisis response that included rather than excluded tribal members when circumstances warranted. "We've had other situations," Millicent explained quietly as she examined Kokosee's wounds by lamplight. "Trading relationships sometimes bring injured folk for help. Word has spread that we treat injuries first and ask questions later." She looked directly at Rebecca. Though hosting a child targeted by traffickers while harboring armed warriors is a new level of complexity, the frank assessment invited an honest response. "I pulled him from the river near death, would have sent him back to his people as soon as he could travel, except the raiders tracked him to my cabin." Rebecca paused, then continued with the truth that had been crystallizing since the siege began. "I discovered tonight that some choices transform you beyond return to what you were before." Millicent's experienced hands continued their examination, while her eyes studied Rebecca's face. "The frontier demands such choices regularly. Most folks just don't recognize them as transformative when they're making them." She gestured to freshly cleaned wounds. "These are healing well. You did solid work with limited supplies." The compliment, coming from someone of obvious expertise, meant more than Rebecca had expected. For months she had managed her isolated cabin with competence born of necessity, but the validation from another woman who understood frontier medical challenges affirmed decisions made in desperate circumstances. Outside the healing cabin, the night's events continued rippling outward. Rebecca could hear discussions between settlement folk and the warriors, initial wariness giving way to shared concerns about regional security. The raid had done more than threaten one child. It had revealed vulnerabilities affecting everyone who lived between formal jurisdictions. "The boy's speaking more now," Millicent reported, wiping sweat from Kokosee's forehead. "Fever's breaking properly. With decent rest and food, he'll recover strength faster than expected. Children are remarkably resilient." As if to confirm her assessment, Kokosee's eyes opened with more clarity than Rebecca had seen since finding him. He looked around the unfamiliar cabin, registered the presence of tribal warriors, then focused on Rebecca with an expression that combined gratitude and loss. "My sister," he whispered in careful English. "They took Nikiwa. She is 5 summers old." The simple statement hit the gathered adults like physical force. The raid hadn't been random violence, but targeted child theft, and somewhere another young captive needed rescue. Rebecca felt the complexity of their situation multiply exponentially. Wapashuwuk and Mikist exchanged meaningful looks before the older warrior spoke. "Tell us what you remember about where they took Nikiwa. Every detail, no matter how small." As Kokosi began recounting his escape in fragments, the adults realized their night's victory represented only the beginning of a larger challenge. Somewhere in the darkness, other children remained in the hands of traffickers, and the network that enabled such crime operated with disturbing efficiency. "This isn't ending with one successful defense," Daniel Whitmore observed grimly. "We've kicked a hornet's nest. Those raiders won't simply abandon profitable territory because one group fought back." Rebecca listened to these strategic discussions, while maintaining her focus on Kokosi's immediate needs. But she also felt something shifting in her perception of frontier life. The isolation she had chosen after Thomas's death had been partially an illusion, a way of avoiding engagement with conflicts that affected her community, whether she participated or not. "The fort at Limestone Creek maintains formal neutrality," Thomas Whitmore reminded the group. "But they also keep records of trading patterns, unusual movements, groups that pass through. If we're serious about addressing this trafficking network, information gathering becomes crucial." The conversation was evolving from crisis response into strategic planning. Rebecca found herself included in discussions that would have been unthinkable 48 hours earlier, not as Thomas Morrison's widow seeking community acceptance, but as someone who had demonstrated commitment to shared principles despite personal cost. "Your cabin's destruction wasn't random revenge," Mikist pointed out, returning their attention to immediate concerns. "Raiders knew your location specifically. Someone provided information about Kokosi's presence there." The implications stunned everyone. The trafficking network included local informants, people within their own communities who identified valuable targets for the raiders. Trust, already complicated in borderland settlements, gained another layer of necessary skepticism. As dawn approached, the night's violent events had transformed into something larger than emergency defense of one child. Rebecca suddenly found herself at the center of an emerging alliance between settlements, tribal members, and individuals who recognized that frontier survival increasingly demanded cooperation against shared threats rather than isolation-based. On cultural differences, the burned remains of her cabin smoldered several miles away, but Rebecca felt no grief for its loss. The structure had sheltered one phase of her frontier life, the widow learning to survive independently. Its destruction had announced the beginning of another, the woman who had chosen resistance over submission and discovered that some choices once made create irreversible momentum toward unknown but necessary futures. The sun was rising now, casting pale light through the cabin's single window. Kokosi slept peacefully for the first time in days, his small body finally relaxed, in the safety of multiple protectors. Around him, an unlikely coalition had formed, not through formal treaty or government intervention, but through shared response to immediate crisis. Rebecca Morrison looked around the healing cabin at faces she hadn't known existed 48 hours earlier, and realized that pulling an injured child from the river had been the smallest choice in a cascade of decisions that would reshape her understanding of community, justice, and belonging on the American frontier. The drums that would soon echo through the forest carried different meanings now, not just signals of tribal communication, but announcements of a transformation none of them could yet fully comprehend. 3 days passed in the Whitmore settlement with a strange mixture of tension and unexpected routine. Kokosi's recovery accelerated under Millicent's care, his fever breaking completely, and appetite returning with encouraging vigor. Rebecca found herself settling into the community's rhythm, morning chores shared between neighbors, midday meals where tables stretched to accommodate whoever needed feeding, and evening discussions that ranged from practical logistics to philosophical debates about frontier justice. The alliance forged during the raid's violence deepened through shared daily life. Wapashuwuk and Mikist remained not as temporary guests, but as integral participants in community defense planning. Their knowledge of regional terrain and tribal movements complemented the settlers' understanding of trade routes and official communications. What emerged was a clearer picture of the trafficking network's scope, one that extended from Louisiana markets through Kentucky trading posts and into frontier territories where children could disappear without official notice. On the third morning, as Rebecca helped Millicent prepare medicinal tinctures, a rider approached with news that crystallized their developing plans into urgent action. Samuel Porter, a trader known for reliable information, had encountered disturbing intelligence during his journey from Louisville. "There's talk of a gathering," Porter reported, accepting coffee with grateful hands. "Big shipment being prepared. Somewhere south of the Kentucky border, multiple raiding groups bringing their acquisitions to be consolidated for transport. They're speaking of 20 children or more." The number struck the assembled listeners silent. 20 children meant organized predation on a scale beyond isolated raids. Wapashuwuk's expression darkened as he processed the implications. "The autumn gathering," he said slowly. "We had heard rumors, but dismissed them as impossible. An actual market, established by those who trade in human lives." "When?" Rebecca asked, though she already suspected the answer carried urgency. "Within a fortnight," Porter continued. "The location isn't fixed. They move it each year. But traders mentioned landmarks that suggest somewhere along the Salt River, where territories blur enough to avoid jurisdictional oversight." Mikist stood abruptly, his usual calm replaced by barely controlled anger. "Among those children will be Shawnee, taken in raids like Kokosi's village, including his sister Nikiwa." The declaration aligned everyone's priorities instantly. Theoretical discussion about territorial justice transformed into immediate planning for a rescue operation that would challenge every convention of frontier law enforcement. "A dozen men could become 20 children," Thomas Whitmore mused. "Already calculating logistics. But we'd need precise intelligence about guard strength, terrain advantages, escape routes, and legitimacy," Daniel Whitmore added. "Anything that looks like a territorial invasion could trigger larger conflicts. Official channels exist for a reason." His words struck Rebecca with particular force. She had seen how official channels had failed to address the trafficking problem. Indeed, how some officials might be involved in overlooking or even facilitating such activities. But unauthorized raids carried their own dangers, potentially triggering broader hostilities between communities that had maintained peace through careful diplomacy. "There's another approach," she said quietly, waiting until all attention focused on her. "Someone needs to infiltrate their gathering, gather evidence, mark locations of captives, identify key players. Information becomes powerful as bullets. In the right circumstances." The suggestion shocked everyone, particularly when its implications became clear. Rebecca was proposing not just intelligence gathering, but active deception, placing someone inside a criminal network where discovery meant death. "Too dangerous," James Whitmore objected immediately. "These aren't ordinary criminals. They've operated successfully for years by trusting no one they don't know." "Which is why it can't be a stranger," Rebecca countered. "But it also can't be anyone they'd recognize from previous encounters." She paused, letting her meaning sink in. "It needs to be someone unexpected. Someone they wouldn't suspect, because the very idea challenges their assumptions about who participates in such activities." Understanding dawned across faces with varying degrees of concern. Rebecca was suggesting she undertake this infiltration herself. "Absolutely not," Wapashuwuk stated firmly. You have proven your courage and commitment, but this venture requires different skills entirely. Does it? Rebecca challenged. Consider what they expect. Male traders, subordinate women acting as camp servants, tribal reluctance being initiated into profitable enterprise. They don't expect educated white women making independent choices. Millicent, who had remained silent through the discussion, finally spoke. She's right about the assumptions. I've encountered such men at trading posts. They see certain people as invisible because their understanding of the world can't accommodate other possibilities. The debate intensified as morning stretched toward afternoon. Rebecca presented her case methodically, drawing on her recent experiences to argue for capabilities that went beyond gender or cultural expectations. The siege defense had proven her ability to function under extreme stress. Her medical knowledge provided legitimate reasons for presence at any gathering where injuries would need treatment. Most importantly, her transformation from isolated widow to active resistance fighter demonstrated adaptability that missions like this demanded. Gradual consensus emerged, reluctant but logical. The tracking and rescue of 20 children required information only infiltration could provide. Rebecca possessed unique qualifications for a specific kind of deception, and time was running out. If we attempt this approach, Thomas Whitmore said carefully, protocols need to be established, communication methods, emergency extraction procedures, clear limitations on risk exposure, and backup, Meekist insisted. Whether or not the infiltration succeeds, we need forces positioned for rapid intervention if circumstances require immediate action. The planning session extended through the day, revealing the collective intelligence of frontier communities. When faced with organized threats, maps were sketched, trade route knowledge shared, signal procedures developed. Rebecca found herself at the center of strategic discussions, where her perspective carried equal weight with experienced scouts and traders. Kokosi's recovery provided unexpected support for the developing plan. His memories of the raid contained details that hadn't emerged during the initial crisis, descriptions of raiders' accents, mentions of specific names, references to previous gatherings he'd overheard during his captivity. Each fragment added to their understanding of the trafficking network structure. There's something else, the boy mentioned during an evening meal, his English improving daily through constant practice. The man who leads them, he knows medicine, uses herbs to keep stolen children calm during transport. I heard him talking about where he learned such things. Rebecca and Millicent exchanged meaningful glances. Medical knowledge among criminals suggested someone with formal training, possibly someone who had been expelled from legitimate practice for ethical violations. This information might provide leverage for Rebecca's assumed identity as a healer seeking unconventional opportunities. As night fell on their third day of planning, the settlement had transformed into an impromptu command center. Children were trained in emergency procedures should the raiders return. Defensive positions were strengthened. Most importantly, communication networks expanded to include tribal scouts and sympathetic settlers who could relay information across distances that would challenge individual travelers. Rebecca spent the evening preparing for her mission, knowing that once begun, there would be no safe retreat. Personal items were selected for their authenticity. Thomas's medical bag, modified to appear worn from extensive travel. Clothing was adjusted to suggest someone slightly down on fortune but maintaining professional standards. Her hair, always neatly maintained, was styled to suggest recent hardship without complete neglect. The psychological preparation proved more challenging than the physical. She would need to convincingly portray someone willing to provide medical services to human traffickers, not as their captive, but as their collaborator. The moral weight of such deception required compartmentalizing her actual motivations behind a performance, convincing enough to survive scrutiny from men whose lives depended on reading threats accurately. Wapashuuk found her sitting outside, the settlement's boundary after midnight, where autumn stars provided clarity lacking in lamplight discussions. "You understand fully what you propose?" he asked without preamble. "Deception at this level requires abandoning who you are, even temporarily. The risk extends beyond physical danger to fundamental changes in how you see yourself." Rebecca nodded. Slowly, "I've already changed from who I was. Finding Kokosi began that transformation. Tonight I discovered what I'm capable of defending. Now I need to learn what I'm capable of pretending to be for those same principles." The older warrior sat beside her in companionable silence for several minutes before speaking again. "The path of the warrior includes difficult choices. Your husband was killed in one such conflict. Your cabin was destroyed by another. This mission could claim your life or your soul, yet still you choose to continue. 20 children," Rebecca said simply, "including a 5-year-old girl who watches for rescue every day, hoping someone remembers she exists. I can't count myself safe while she remains in captivity." Wapashuuk's response revealed respect that transcended cultural boundaries. "You think like a Shawnee warrior. Our people have a term, Nipwain Kamikwe, someone who steps forward when others hesitate. It means she who goes first into danger." The designation carried weight beyond mere description. Rebecca felt herself being formally acknowledged within a tradition that measured worth through action rather than heritage. Whatever happened during her infiltration mission, she had already crossed boundaries that transformed her identity in ways she was still discovering. The practical details of her departure were finalized before dawn. She would travel southeast, toward reported trafficking routes, making contact with information networks Porter had described. Her medical expertise would provide legitimate reason for seeking temporary employment with traveling groups, gradually getting closer to the Salt River gathering. Kokosi insisted on saying farewell personally, despite the early hour. His small face carried a solemnity that made him seem far older than his years. "You go to find my sister," he stated, rather than asked. When Rebecca confirmed this, he removed a small carved pendant from around his neck. "She made this for me last summer. When you find Nikiwa, show her this so she knows I live too, so she knows people come for her." The simple token carried more weight than elaborate equipment. Rebecca fastened it alongside her other preparations, understanding that she carried not just her own determination, but the hopes of a broken family seeking reunion. As the Whitmore settlement stirred to morning activity, Rebecca mounted a sturdy mare selected for endurance rather than speed. Her departure was marked not with dramatic farewells, but with the practical exchange of information, emergency procedures, and promised communication schedules that characterize serious endeavors with life-or-death consequences. The forest path that had once led to her isolated cabin now stretched toward uncertainties that challenged everything she thought she understood about personal risk, moral compromise, and the prices people paid for their principles. Behind her, the unlikely alliance continued preparing for multiple contingencies. Ahead, the trafficking network continued operations that had flourished precisely because they operated beyond the reach of official justice. 20 children waited for rescue that only coordinated resistance could provide. Rebecca Morrison rode toward an infiltration mission that would test whether compassion could survive necessary deception, whether justice could emerge from carefully planned deception, and whether one woman's choice to help an injured child could catalyze changes that rippled far beyond any single life or community. The drums that Kokosi had warned her about during his fevered ramblings now echoed in her. Thoughts not as threats, but as summons to action that acknowledged no boundaries between peoples, only between those who profited from children's suffering and those who would risk everything to stop them. The mission had begun, but its conclusion remained unwritten. In the vast uncertainty of frontier justice, where formal law had failed, and informal networks of resistance offered the only hope for those who couldn't protect themselves. 20 children waited somewhere in the gathering darkness ahead, and Rebecca carried their possibilities toward whatever resolution courage and careful planning might achieve in a land where transformation came through fire and action rather than intention alone. The first phase of Rebecca's infiltration strategy unfolded with painstaking authenticity. Rather than rushing directly toward the reported gathering location, she spent days establishing her cover identity along the well-traveled routes frequented by traders, drifters, and others operating at the margins of frontier society. Her medical skills provided legitimate entry points to conversations, and her carefully cultivated appearance suggested someone available for unconventional employment. At Morrison's Ferry, a river crossing notorious for attracting all manner of travelers, she encountered her first real test. A three-man team had established a temporary camp, their wagon loaded with furs and trade goods, but their eyes held the calculating awareness she had come to recognize in those who dealt in human commerce. "You fixing trades on your own coin, lady?" The leader, a weather-beaten man who introduced himself as Clayton, surveyed her medical satchel and somewhat worn traveling clothes. "Takes certain considerations to operate solo in these parts." Rebecca had rehearsed this moment countless times, but actual performance required summoning conviction she didn't feel. "I specialize in keeping valuable cargo healthy during long transports," she replied carefully. "Sometimes profitable ventures require discretion when certain authorities might not understand necessary business practices." The coded language hung between them like smoke. Clayton's companions exchanged glances that suggested internal communication beyond her hearing. This was the dangerous dance, indicating willingness to compromise morals without appearing too eager, demonstrating medical value without raising suspicions about her actual identity. "We're not traveling that direction currently," Clayton finally responded. "But word gets around about useful skills. There's gatherings coming up where such expertise might be appreciated." He paused meaningfully. "Of course, that kind of work attracts certain scrutiny if folks ain't careful about their associations." The veiled warning contained both threat and invitation. Rebecca nodded slightly, neither pushing too hard nor retreating. "Discretion maintains prosperity for everyone involved. I've learned to ask a few questions about cargo requirements, focusing instead on medical necessities that keep ventures profitable." The conversation concluded without firm commitment, but with understanding established. As Rebecca departed Morrison's Ferry, she carried the weight of a performance that had crossed moral boundaries while maintaining strategic necessity. The role she played demanded compartmentalizing her actual self while inhabiting a character whose values directly opposed everything she fought for. Over the following days, similar interactions multiplied. She avoided deep wilderness routes, where legitimate travelers feared to tread, instead following commercial pathways where information flowed more freely. At each stopping point, isolated farmsteads, temporary traders' camps, small settlements too loose for formal governance, she gathered fragments of intelligence while building her assumed reputation. The pattern of these encounters revealed disturbing details about the trafficking network's scope. References to autumn collections appeared with concerning frequency. Mentions of specific transport routes suggested coordination beyond seasonal opportunism. Most chilling were casual discussions about investment potential, that reduced human children to market commodities with assessed values based on age, health, and perceived compliance. On the 6th day of her mission, Rebecca encountered intelligence that both encouraged and terrified her. At a crossroads settlement called Three Bridges, she overheard two women discussing recent events that aligned with reports about Kokosi's village raid. Heard the Shawnee got hit hard near Pine Ridge. Took a good dozen children before the warriors could organize response, the older woman commented, while drawing water from the communal well. My trading partner said they lost track of one boy, though caused quite the stir because he'd seen too much of their operation. That's why the bosses are moving the gathering forward, her companion replied. Too much attention from last month's activities. Word says they're settling at Salt Creek instead of the river proper. Maybe a week earlier than planned. The intelligence was invaluable. Location confirmation, timeline revision, and evidence that the traffickers were responding to pressure from recent rescue attempts. Rebecca memorized every detail while maintaining her position as casual eavesdropper, but the information created urgent pressure to accelerate her infiltration attempts. That evening, using a code system developed with the Whitmore settlement, she managed to send a message through a sympathetic trader heading northeast. Birds' flight patterns and tree markings, seemingly natural to the casual observer, would inform her allies about the evolving situation while maintaining her cover. Identity, the accelerated timeline, demanded accepting greater risks. Rather than maintaining gradual movement, Rebecca needed to position herself more aggressively for contact with the actual trafficking organization. This meant venturing into territory where legitimate business became increasingly sparse, and everyone appeared to operate with heightened suspicion. Her opportunity arrived when least expected. A wagon breakdown on what locals called Devil's Pass forced her to share a temporary camp with travelers whose cargo remained conspicuously covered and guarded. The medical emergency that brought Rebecca into contact with them came not from their human cargo, carefully concealed and kept silent with the herbs Kokosi had described, but from a guard who had suffered a severe infected wound during a recent altercation. You patch him up right, he's a good earner, the wagon boss, introduced simply as Marcus, informed her while watching her examine the festering gash. Lose too many helpers to carelessness. Smart folks in this business maintain valuable resources. The guard's infection had advanced dangerously, requiring immediate and sustained attention. Rebecca found herself in the position she had maneuvered toward, providing essential medical services to the trafficking network while trying to ignore the covered wagon's contents, which occasionally shifted with movements that suggested human occupancy. I'll need to stay with patient through the crisis point, she stated professionally. Infection this advanced requires monitoring every 4 hours for at least 2 days, during which time your business can continue without disruption. Marcus considered her proposal with obvious calculation. Her continued presence meant trusting an outsider with operational details, but losing an experienced guard might prove more costly than short-term risk. You ride with us to Salt Creek, he decided. Keep him breathing. Keep your focus on medical concerns only, and there might be regular employment available for someone with your skills who understands proper discretion. The arrangement crystallized Rebecca's worst fears and greatest hopes simultaneously. She would travel directly to the trafficking gathering, witnessing horrors she could barely contemplate while gathering intelligence essential for rescue operations. The moral burden of seeming complicity would test every aspect of her resolve. As their combined group proceeded southeast, Rebecca maintained careful observational discipline. She counted guards, noted weapons, tracked route preferences, and memorized faces of key personnel. Most importantly, she listened for specific information about children's locations, guard rotations, and planned transport schedules. The infected guard's treatment provided cover for her attention to logistics rather than active partnership in their criminal operations. Through careful medical conversations, she learned that the gathering would include representatives from multiple trafficking cells, suggesting an opportunity to damage the broader network if rescue operations could be properly coordinated. But the human cost of her infiltration grew daily. Muffled sounds from the covered wagon included children's cries, quickly quieted by whatever methods the traffickers employed. During nighttime camps, she observed barely glimpsed figures being fed and managed like livestock, their faces filled with terror and hopelessness that made her medical examination of voluntary patients feel like profound hypocrisy. Rebecca's personal compartmentalization strategies began showing strain on the third day of traveling with the trafficking group. Her sleep became fitful, filled with nightmares where she was unable to distinguish between her assumed identity and her actual self. The boundaries between necessary deception and genuine involvement blurred as she participated in daily routines that normalized horrific treatment of human beings. The crisis came when a child, perhaps 7 years old, approximately Kokosi's age, fell seriously ill during transport. Marcus brought the boy to Rebecca for evaluation, his concern purely economic rather than humanitarian. "This one's worth good money in Louisville markets if he stays healthy," Marcus explained casually. "Fever's burning up the investment. You got anything to bring him around?" Looking at the sick child's face, Rebecca confronted the full moral complexity of her position. Providing care meant helping the traffickers maintain their valuable property. Refusing meant watching a child suffer or die. Her mission's strategic goals clashed directly with immediate ethical demands. She treated the child, administering herbs to break the fever while touching his hand in a way that she hoped conveyed understanding beyond words. The boy's eyes met hers with recognition that transcended their impossible circumstances. Another innocent caught in the machinery of human commerce, another piece of cargo that once had family and home. That night, as campfire conversations revealed more details about the upcoming gathering, Rebecca realized her infiltration had reached a critical juncture. The Salt Creek location was confirmed, along with an estimated 40 total captives, including children from multiple raids. The gathering would include buyers from as far away as New Orleans, suggesting truly commercial-scale operations. She had the intelligence needed for rescue planning, but extraction posed enormous challenges. Her assumed identity had grown complex. Enough that sudden disappearance might trigger pursuit that endangered her actual mission, yet remaining longer risked either discovery of her true purpose or complicity that would fundamentally alter her sense of self. The solution emerged through careful observation of guards' routines and geographical awareness gained during her frontier years. On their fourth evening approaching Salt Creek, the group camped near terrain she recognized, a series of limestone caves that Thomas had once shown her during their early Western explorations. Rebecca identified a window of opportunity during usual guard changes at the wagon. When attention focused on securing captives for the night, she could excuse herself for gathering medical herbs in an area known to contain cave systems suitable for concealment. If timing aligned precisely, she could disappear into underground passages that emerged miles from the trafficking camp, carrying crucial intelligence while maintaining enough mystery about her fate to avoid immediate pursuit. The escape plan required abandoning all equipment except essential information and the small carved pendant Kokosi had given her for his sister. Every possession would be forfeit, her carefully built medical reputation destroyed, her presence at Salt Creek gathering aborted before witnessing its full horror. But the intelligence gathered over 8 days of infiltration could save 20 children's lives if properly utilized. As Rebecca prepared for her escape attempt, she acknowledged how thoroughly the mission had transformed her understanding of moral choices under extreme circumstances. She had inhabited a character willing to profit from child trafficking, maintained that deception through daily interaction with actual traffickers, and treated their human cargo when economic rather than humanitarian motivations demanded it. The psychological cost was immense, but reconnaissance had revealed target information essential for successful rescue operations. Tomorrow would determine whether her infiltration's gains justified its personal price, and whether the network of resistance developing around Kokosi's rescue could effectively challenge organized predation that had operated unchallenged for years. As she traced her escape route in the darkness outside camp, Rebecca Morrison faced the definitive test of principles forged in frontier hardship and refined through choices that challenged everything comfortable about her former life. The isolated widow who had avoided frontier conflicts now possessed knowledge that could reshape how communities addressed threats operating beyond official law enforcement. Night sounds masked her careful preparations, but couldn't quiet the questions that accompanied such transformation. Was justice worth becoming someone you despised, even temporarily? Did saving 20 children justify methods that compromised your essential beliefs about who you were? The answers would emerge not through contemplation, but action. Dawn would bring either successful intelligence extraction or catastrophic discovery that could end both mission and life. Rebecca settled into final preparations with grim determination, knowing that frontier survival increasingly demanded exactly such impossible choices between competing moral imperatives. The drums Kokosi had heard during his escape now echoed. In her thoughts, as more than threat or warning, they had become rhythmic markers of an approaching confrontation where individual courage would be tested against organized cruelty, and where the price of resistance included temporary alliance with everything her actual self opposed. Tomorrow's attempt at escape would determine whether compassion could survive necessary deception, and whether one woman's willingness to inhabit moral darkness might help bring light to children whose captivity had isolated them beyond conventional rescue possibilities. The escape attempt happened exactly as Rebecca had calculated, but not at all as she had anticipated. Dawn was approaching when she slipped away from the trafficking camp, following the faint deer trails that led toward the limestone caves. The guard change had proceeded like clockwork, and she had made a show of gathering medicinal plants near the tree line before carefully positioning herself for what should have been an unobserved departure. The first indication something was wrong came from the forest itself. Birds that should have been greeting dawn remained silent. Small creatures that typically rustled through undergrowth were absent. The natural world had gone quiet in a way that meant only one thing: human watchers, positioned and waiting. Rebecca froze at the mouth of the first cave, her medical bag clutched in one hand, Kokosi's pendant pressed against her palm. Behind her, the trafficking camp remained undisturbed, guards maintaining their posts without apparent awareness of her absence. Ahead, the cave passage stretched into darkness that could offer either salvation or trap. The voice that emerged from that darkness answered her question before she could form it. Expected you yesterday, actually. Been watching you wrestle with the moral complexity of your situation. A figure stepped into the pale pre-dawn light. Not a trafficker or guard, but Meekist, the young Shawnee warrior who had defended her cabin. Wapashawuk thought you might need guidance finding your way out of here. Relief flooded through Rebecca, followed immediately by confusion. How could you possibly know? Your messages reached us. We've been tracking this trafficking group for 3 days, waiting for optimum rescue conditions. Mikist gestured deeper into the cave. The full alliance is positioned around Salt Creek. Warriors, armed settlers, even some sympathetic soldiers. From Fort Nelson, who've grown tired of inactive responses to child trafficking. Rebecca followed him into the cave system, her mind reeling with implications. But the gathering, the 40 captives, the buyers from New Orleans, all under observation. We've been mapping their security patterns, identifying key targets, and planning extraction routes for every captive, including your patient back at camp. Mikist handed her a water skin. Your infiltration provided crucial inside intelligence, but it also placed you in extreme danger. Wapashuwok decided extraction timing was more important than waiting for all possible information. The revelation transformed Rebecca's entire understanding of the situation. Her solo mission had never been truly solo. The alliance developed. After defending her cabin, had evolved into coordinated resistance, operating beyond anything she had imagined possible. The sick boy in their wagon, 7 years old, dark hair, fever. What about him? Already identified for priority extraction. Your medical report, passed through trading networks, included physical descriptions that matched children from 3 different raids. Mikist's expression remained serious. 43 captives total, including 13 from Kokosi's village. His sister Nikiwa is confirmed among them. As they moved through the cave system, guided by markers that indicated recent scouting, Mikist revealed the full scope of their coordinated operation. The trafficking gathering had been under surveillance since Rebecca's intelligence updates had provided location and timeline confirmation. Multiple teams were positioned not just for rescue, but for capturing key participants in the network. The plan requires your cooperation, Mikist continued as they emerged from a concealed cave exit, miles from the trafficking camp. You know, the camp layout, guard rotations, and most importantly, you can identify the medical supplies that might be used to keep children docile during transport. Rebecca found herself mentally shifting from infiltrator escaping custody to advisor planning rescue operation. The psychological transition demanded adjusting to a reality where her deceptions were complete and her knowledge could be applied directly towards saving lives. Marcus keeps the herbal sedatives in the wagon boss's personal kit, she reported immediately. The infected guard I've been treating won't be mobile for another 2 days minimum. The wagon with the 8 youngest children positions nearest. The main fire for warmth. They're using it as a humanitarian gesture to justify their operations to new recruits. Information flowed as they walked toward a predetermined meeting location where the full rescue force had assembled. Rebecca learned that her 8 days among the traffickers had occurred within a larger framework of resistance that included tribal warriors from multiple clans, settlers from 5 different communities, and even some official personnel operating outside formal channels. The gathering point revealed the true scale of coordinated opposition. Almost 60 armed individuals had assembled, their mixed composition, white, tribal, military, and civilian, representing fusion of frontier elements unified against common threat. Wapashuwok emerged from this group, his expression combining relief at her safety and determination for the coming action. Your information has determined our approach, he informed her without preamble. Multiple simultaneous distractions, coordinated extractions, and most importantly, capture rather than kill key traffickers when possible. We need to expose the full network, not just end individual operations. Rebecca began sketching the camp, layout in soft earth, marking guard positions, wagon arrangements, and the carefully observed patterns she had memorized. Other resistance members added details from their external observations, creating a comprehensive map that suggested vulnerabilities. Her inside position hadn't revealed. There's something else, she said, remembering a detail that had troubled her during infiltration. Marcus keeps mentioning someone called the Louisville Merchant, apparently a major buyer who connects frontier trafficking to eastern markets. He's supposed to arrive at the gathering tomorrow evening. This intelligence prompted immediate strategic recalculation. Capturing such a high-level connection could damage the trafficking network far beyond simple rescue operations. The mission's scope expanded from tactical child evacuation to strategic disruption of organized criminal infrastructure. As morning fully arrived, Rebecca found herself integrated into combat planning rather than medical support. Her physical appearance, still coded as a collaborator who had fled unexpectedly, could be weaponized for initial confusion when rescue operations began. The moral complexity of maintaining her infiltration costume for actual rescue added layers to an already psychologically demanding operation. "The timing works in our favor," Thomas Whitmore observed, studying their tactical map. "Evening gathering means limited daylight for escape after rescue begins. Traffickers will prioritize saving their wagon loads over pursuing individuals, especially if our diversions prove effective." As the day progressed, Rebecca moved between different planning groups, contributing medical insight about captive conditions, security details observation had provided, and psychological understanding of how traumatized children might respond to sudden liberation. Her unique position, neither warrior nor settler, neither leader nor follower, enabled bridging perspectives that pure military or traditional tribal approaches might miss. The afternoon brought additional intelligence from scouts. The Louisville merchant had arrived early, accompanied by a security detail that suggested governmental or military connections. His presence elevated both opportunity and risk for the evening operation. "He's established in the best position of camp," reported a settler who'd maintained distant observation. 3 personal guards plus utilization of camp security. But his wagon carries documentation, bills of sale, transport records, contact lists, information we've been seeking for months. Rebecca listened to these developments with growing understanding that her infiltration had served as a catalyst for confrontation far larger than an individual rescue mission. The trafficking network's annual gathering had become a battleground where frontier resistance challenged organized predation operating between legal jurisdictions. As afternoon descended toward evening, final preparations accelerated. Weapons were distributed, positions assigned, and signal procedures reviewed. Rebecca found herself checking medical supplies for post-mission treatment while mentally preparing for violence she had deliberately avoided since her cabin's destruction. The plan called for initiating action during the gathering's evening meal, when attention would focus on business discussions and security would be most relaxed. Multiple, simultaneous actions, controlled fires for distraction, coordinated advances on wagon positions, and specific targeting of authority figures would create chaos sufficient for extracting children while capturing key network participants. Once action begins, your medical badge becomes liability rather than asset, Wapashawuk advised. Transition from your false identity to known ally. Wear this. He handed her a distinctive feather arrangement that marked tribal allies. Warriors will recognize the protection code. Settlers know you from cabin defense. The symbolic transition. Accepting tribal alliance marker while shedding her trafficking infiltration identity represented the final psychological shift from deception to open resistance. Rebecca fastened the feathers alongside Kokosi's pendant, carrying emblems of both her transformation and her mission's original purpose. As sunset approached, the assembled resistance force moved into final positions around Salt Creek Camp. Rebecca accompanied the extraction team, designated for the wagon containing the youngest captives, her medical skills prioritized for treating those who had suffered under prolonged sedation. The traffickers' gathering proceeded with increasing activity as darkness fell. Business discussions mixed with casual violence toward captives, creating an atmosphere where commercial normality masked profound human rights violations. From concealed positions, Rebecca observed the camp she had fled that morning, now seeing it with eyes adjusted to understanding what coordinated resistance could accomplish. The signal came not as sound, but as multiple simultaneous diversions. Small fires erupted at camp perimeter, arrows whistled past guard positions, and shouts of confusion echoed from various directions. The trafficking camp, organized for routine security against individual attempts, struggled to coordinate response against multi-point assault. Rebecca moved with her extraction team toward the wagon containing 8 youngest captives, her tribal, feathers marking her as an ally rather than an infiltrator to those who might recognize her. Guards, who she had observed treating children like inventory, now found themselves fighting for position against warriors who understood this terrain intimately. The first rescued child she encountered was the sick boy she had treated during her infiltration, his fever broken but eyes still reflecting traumatization, his recognition of her combined fear and hope, unsure whether she represented continued captivity or possible liberation. "You're safe now," she whispered, using the medical authority she had built during infiltration to soothe rather than intimidate. "These warriors, these people, they've come to take you home." Around them, the rescue operation unfolded with remarkable precision. Coordinated team actions overwhelmed the traffickers' responsive capabilities while avoiding general massacre that might create a cycle of retaliation. Captives were systematically moved from wagons to evacuation points where pre-positioned transportation waited. But the Louisville merchant proved a more challenging target than anticipated. His security detail fought with professional discipline, and his wagon, containing the documentation crucial for exposing the broader network, became the focal point of increasingly desperate engagement. Rebecca, her medical role shifting to tactical support, found herself advancing toward that wagon with 5 warriors and 3 settlers who recognized the intelligence value might justify additional risk. As exchanges intensified, she realized the mission had evolved beyond rescue toward confrontation with authority structures that enabled such trafficking. The breakthrough came when Marcus, the wagon boss whose guard she had treated, found himself surrounded but offered information rather than resistance. "The merchant keeps ledgers, correspondence with official contacts, transport routes," he shouted above escalating action. "I give you access, but you guarantee my life." Negotiated surrender within active combat represented frontier justice at its most pragmatic. Rebecca participated in accepting Marcus's capitulation while securing a medicine chest she knew contained important evidence alongside herbal supplies. The wagon she had observed from inside was now being conquered from outside, its contents transitioning from criminal inventory to rescued children and damning documentation. Lightning illuminated the chaotic scene, not natural storm, but torches and muzzle flashes, creating hellish visibility across Salt Creek Camp. The trafficking gathering's commercial atmosphere had dissolved into desperate flight and coordinated extraction, as the resistance operation demonstrated what organized opposition could accomplish against predation that had operated with impunities. The sound of gunfire diminished, and cries of rescued children began replacing shouts of combat. Rebecca recognized her mission had entered the final phase. Infiltration, intelligence gathering, and escape had merged into active participation in larger conflict, where justice demanded more than individual heroism, but collective commitment to protecting Frontier's most vulnerable inhabitants. The mission had transformed from rescue to exposure, from tactical action to strategic victory against a criminal network that had thought itself beyond challenge. Tomorrow would reveal full consequences of tonight's events, but as Rebecca helped evacuate children toward predetermined safe positions, she knew the frontier's balance had fundamentally shifted. The drums that had haunted their imagination since. Hokusai's initial warnings now transformed into rhythm of coordinated victory, 60 individuals who had chosen resistance over passive acceptance, who had forged alliance across cultural boundaries against common threat, and who had demonstrated that organized evil could be confronted by organized good when community transcended traditional divisions. Dawn would bring accounting, children reunited with families, documents exposing trafficking infrastructure, prisoners facing frontier justice, and alliance tested by success, considering future challenges. But night belonged to action that had already rewritten rules about what frontiers could accomplish when people chose courage over convenience, cooperation over isolation, and justice over comfortable complacency. Rebecca Morrison, who had pulled an injured child from the river 10 days earlier, now coordinated medical care for 43 rescued captives whose liberation had been achieved through a mission that challenged every assumption about individual capability, community obligation, and transformation possible when circumstances demanded evolution beyond previous limitations. The mission had succeeded beyond its original scope, establishing precedent for frontier resistance that would ripple across territories where official law failed to protect those most vulnerable. And somewhere in chaos of victory, a carved pendant waited to be returned to a young girl named Nikiwa, connecting the rescue operation's larger significance to personal promise that individual lives mattered more than political boundaries or racial divisions. As dawn broke over the Salt Creek battlefield, the true scope of the night's victory revealed itself through a landscape transformed not just by combat, but by liberation. 43 children huddled around carefully tended fires, their faces reflecting the impossible transition from captivity to freedom. Medical stations established throughout the secured area addressed immediate physical needs, while deeper healing began through simple human contact offered without expectation or coercion. Rebecca moved between these stations, her medical expertise finally aligned with her moral intentions. The sick boy she had treated during infiltration received continued care, but now within a context where his recovery served his own needs rather than market value. Each child's treatment became an act of restoration rather than property maintenance. Each dose of medicine an affirmation of humanity rather than investment protection. Near the Eastern Fire, she discovered what she had been searching for since the rescue began. A small girl, 5 years old, distinctive beadwork partially torn from her dress, sat wrapped in a blanket too large for her frame. Nikiwa, Kokosi's sister, survivor of a raid that had separated siblings and threatened to end stories that hadn't yet been told. Rebecca approached carefully, aware that sudden movements could trigger trauma responses. She settled nearby without forcing attention, allowing the child to acknowledge her presence at her own pace. When Nikiwa's eyes finally met hers, Rebecca carefully withdrew the carved pendant from her pocket. "Your brother Kokose made this. He asked me to show it to you when I found you." She placed the small wooden carving where the girl could see it clearly. "He wanted you to know he survived, and that people came for you." Recognition dawned slowly across the child's face, followed by emotion too large for her small frame to contain. Through tears that spoke of pain, loss, and desperate hope, Nikiwa reached for the pendant with trembling fingers. "Is he... Did the warriors find him too?" Her voice carried an accent that matched her brother's, mixing formal tribal structure with frontier vocabulary children acquired through cultural interaction. "He's safe at the Whitmore settlement. His injuries are healing, and he talks about you every day." Rebecca passed the child a cup of warm broth, maintaining a therapeutic routine while establishing emotional connection. "Would you like to see him? We can arrange travel once you're stronger." The reunion promise planted seeds of future rebuilding while acknowledging present exhaustion. Around them, similar connections were being forged between rescued children and the warriors who had located family members, settlers offering temporary care, and healers addressing psychological wounds that extended beyond physical trauma. Mikest, appeared through morning mist carrying reports that confirmed strategic success. 18 traffickers captured alive, including the Louisville merchant and 2 secondary coordination figures. Marcus provided full cooperation, identifying network connections throughout 3 territories. Documentation recovered suggests operations from Gulf markets to the Canadian border. The intelligence coup validated risks undertaken during both infiltration and rescue phases. Rebecca's 8 days among the criminals had provided tactical knowledge, but the coordinated assault had secured strategic evidence, exposing infrastructure that enabled systematic child trafficking across a massive geographical range. Legal proceedings will prove complex, Thomas Whitmore observed, reviewing initial document inventory. Multiple jurisdictions, tribal sovereignty questions, and military personnel implicated in either active participation or willful negligence. This evidence challenges official narratives maintained by territorial governors. Wapashuwok nodded slowly, his expression revealing years of accumulated wisdom about frontier justice intricacies. Truth often threatens those who profit from comfort with partial information. Exposing a full network means confronting not just criminals, but systems that allow such operations through inaction or selective enforcement. The philosophical implications of their victory extended beyond immediate rescue. 43 children would return to families or find new homes within communities prepared to help traumatized young people rebuild shattered worlds. But the evidence gathered threatened to expose official complicity that reached into territorial and federal levels. "We need to be strategic about revelation timing," Rebecca suggested, drawing from her newfound understanding of frontier politics developed through her infiltration experience. Simultaneous exposure across multiple jurisdictions prevents isolated suppression. Tribal representatives, military reformers, and settler communities must coordinate disclosure to ensure maximum impact. Her analysis struck those assembled as surprisingly sophisticated. The isolated widow, who had avoided political engagement, now demonstrated nuanced understanding of how information could be weaponized for justice rather than exploitation. As morning progressed, logistics of the aftermath proved as complex as combat operations. Children required medical assessment, nutritional rehabilitation, and eventual transport to identified family or appropriate care arrangements. Captured traffickers needed secure containment while evidence was processed and legal protocols determined. Most challenging was coordinating narrative release to ensure accountability, rather than regional conflict escalation. The alliance forged during rescue operations now faced tests of sustained cooperation. Tribal warriors, frontier settlers, military personnel, and civilian authorities needed to maintain unity while navigating complications that could fragment coalition along cultural or ideological lines. "The children provide our moral clarity," Millicent Whitmore declared during a crucial planning session. Whatever political complexities emerge, keeping their welfare central prevents distraction into less important disagreements. Her perspective grounded discussions that might otherwise spiral into abstract debate. Medical needs, educational considerations, and family reunification remained primary metrics for success, regardless of broader implications for territorial law or intergovernmental relations. By midday, the first children departed toward confirmed family reunifications. Tribal scouts had located villages where parents waited anxiously for news about offspring taken during raids. The sight of these departures, children embracing relatives they feared forever lost, provided emotional validation for risks. Undertaken by every alliance member, Nikiwa's reunion with Kokosi occurred 3 days later at the Whitmore settlement. Rebecca had transported her personally, monitoring the girl's recovery during a careful journey designed to rebuild a sense of safety while anticipating family connection. The moment siblings discovered each other alive created an instant of pure joy that transcended weeks of trauma, loss, and desperate survival. "I told them you would come," Kokosi whispered against his sister's hair, his own tears mixing with hers. "I told them someone was helping us. You found her. You kept your promise." Rebecca watched this reunion while understanding it represented only one story among 43 requiring resolution. Each rescued child carried unique experiences of captivity, loss, and liberation that would influence their recovery over months or years, requiring sustained community support. The aftermath continued through weeks that tested alliance cohesion while revealing unexpected strength in cooperation developed through the crisis. Documentation evidence triggered investigations reaching into federal offices, exposing trafficking networks that extended beyond local criminal enterprise into systematic exploitation protected by selective legal blindness. Rebecca found her role evolving once again. While tribal members focused on child welfare within traditional healing practices and settlers addressed practical infrastructure needs, her medical expertise bridged cultural approaches, while her infiltration experience informed legal proceedings, requiring detailed testimony about network operations. "You've become something neither your former life nor initial experience would have predicted," Wapashuwok observed during one of their strategic meetings. Medicine woman, warrior advocate, bridge between worlds that often refuse acknowledgement. Such transformation comes through choices made when comfort would have been an easier path. His assessment resonated deeply with Rebecca's own emerging self-understanding. The quiet widow who had avoided frontier complications now actively participated in reshaping regional approaches to organized crime and children's protection. Her cabin's destruction had opened space for constructing identity that transcended both limitation and expectation. The formal trial of captured traffickers, when it finally convened 3 months later, drew representatives from multiple governmental levels and tribal nations. Rebecca's testimony provided a crucial inside perspective on operational methods, while broader evidence demonstrated the systematic nature of trafficking enterprise. Most significantly, proceedings established precedents for cooperation between tribal justice systems and territorial authorities when addressing crimes affecting multiple communities. The Louisville merchants' connections implicated officials whose removal created openings for reformers more committed to actual law enforcement than profitable ambiguity. But the truest measure of success occurred through gradual reintegration of rescued children into normal life patterns. Some returned to families reconstituted after the tragedy. Others found adoption within communities that had developed fostering structures specifically for trafficking survivors. All continued healing processes that would define their futures. More powerfully than their captivity experiences, Nikiwa and Kokosi exemplified this recovery trajectory. Their shared survival had bonded siblings through trauma, but reunion within a supportive community environment enabled them to remember and build upon life before their village raid. Their adaptation demonstrated resilience that inspired both tribal and settler participants in their care. 6 months after the Salt Creek rescue, Rebecca stood at the site where she had pulled Kokosi from the river, though this time she wasn't alone. The land where her cabin had stood now supported a community meeting house built through cooperative effort between tribal members and frontier settlers. Its design blended construction techniques from both traditions while serving shared purposes that transcended cultural origin. "Sometimes I wonder what Thomas would think," she mused, watching children play in the clearing where she had once maintained isolating independence. Whether he'd recognize the woman who walked this place, concentrating only on daily survival, Wapashuuk, who had become a trusted confidant rather than occasional visitor, considered her reflection carefully. Perhaps he would see completion rather than change. The person willing to help the injured child was always present. Circumstances simply required a larger expression of that fundamental character. His perspective aligned with Rebecca's own evolving understanding. The frontier had demanded transformation, not as abandonment of essential self, but as expansion toward capabilities she hadn't known she possessed. Each choice, from pulling Kokosi from the river through infiltrating criminal networks, had built upon core values rather than replacing them. The community that developed around their shared experiences reshaped local approach to frontier challenges. Rather than isolated homesteads maintaining defensive self-sufficiency, cooperative networks evolved that could respond effectively to threats no individual family could address alone. The trafficking network's exposure catalyzed regional recognition that some problems demanded collective solutions transcending traditional divisions. Rebecca's weekly medical rounds now included visits to multiple settlements where traditional boundaries blurred through practical cooperation. Her expertise served both tribal and settler communities, while her understanding of how crises revealed character informed conflict resolution approaches that prevented escalation into violence. The child rescue mission had achieved its tactical objectives while establishing strategic frameworks for frontier communities addressing shared challenges. 43 lives restored represented immediate victory, but systemic change in how frontier populations understood collective responsibility promised longer-term transformation. The drums still echo sometimes, Rebecca mentioned to Nikiwa during one of the girls' healing sessions, but their meaning has changed from warning to announcement, from isolation to connection. The young girl, demonstrating wisdom beyond her years, nodded with understanding that encompassed her own journey from captivity to recovery. The drums helped you find us. Maybe they were calling all along, waiting for people brave enough to answer. Her insight encapsulated perhaps the deepest truth emerging from their shared experience. The frontier's challenges had always demanded courage, but recognizing opportunities for cooperation rather than defaulting to defensive isolation opened possibilities for addressing threats that overwhelmed individual resistance. 1 year after Kokosei's rescue, the anniversary was marked not with commemoration of the crisis, but with celebration of community resilience. Children from multiple heritages played together in spaces built for shared purpose. Adults maintained practical cooperation through challenges that might have triggered conflict in previous circumstances. Rebecca Morrison, who had begun this transformation by choosing compassion over caution, now represented integration of cultures previously separated by perceived necessity. Her marriage to Mikist 3 months earlier had surprised no one who understood the alliance forged through shared action, though it challenged traditional expectations on both sides of cultural boundaries. The ceremony itself reflected achieved synthesis, conducted according to tribal customs that acknowledged spiritual connections beyond formal ritual, attended by settlers who had learned to value different wisdom traditions, blessed by Wapashuuk, while officiated by the Whitmore settlements. Designated authority, it embodied cooperation that had developed from desperate necessity into chosen community. Standing in the meeting house that occupied her former cabin's site, Rebecca looked across faces reflecting Frontier's evolving character. Some still carried wariness developed through years of defending against perceived threats. Others showed openness to possibilities their isolation had previously prevented them from recognizing. But increasingly, the dominant expression was determination to maintain an alliance that had proven effective against challenges no single group could have addressed independently. The trafficking network's exposure continued generating legal and social impact throughout the territories, but its immediate effect was demonstrating what coordinated resistance could accomplish when properly motivated. 43 children, Rebecca said softly to herself, though meekest heard and understood the reference, each carrying story of horror transformed through collective choice to act rather than observe. Her husband's response reflected both cultural tradition and personal experience of that transformation. In our traditions, such rescue carries responsibility beyond initial action. Those saved become part of the community's continuing story. Their healing becomes everyone's investment in future possibility. The wisdom resonated through everything Rebecca had experienced during her year of dramatic transformation. Individual heroism had initiated response, but sustainable change emerged through sustained commitment by communities choosing cooperation over comfortable separation. As evening approached and families gathered for the communal meal that had become a weekly tradition, Rebecca took inventory of transformation that extended beyond her personal journey. The Frontier's character was evolving through practical demonstration that shared challenges demanded shared responses. Children who had survived trafficking through collective rescue now played together regardless of tribal or cultural inheritance. Adults who had maintained suspicious distance now consulted openly about problems ranging from agricultural techniques to defensive preparations. Knowledge flowed across previously rigid boundaries as circumstances proved that isolation offered false security against threats requiring coordinated response. The wilderness taught individual strength, she reflected during the gathering, watching Kokosi demonstrate traditional craft techniques to settler children while learning their agricultural methods. But true survival demanded recognizing when solitary capability needed support from unexpected directions. This insight had become foundational for the community developing in their region. Rather than abandoning frontier individualism, they had evolved toward understanding that personal strength achieved greatest effect through strategic alliance with others possessing complementary capabilities. The meeting house filled with sounds of shared meal preparation, children's laughter, planning discussions for upcoming shared projects, and the comfortable hum of community that had replaced defensive silence once characteristic of isolated homesteads. Rebecca Morrison, who had transformed from grieving widow through reluctant warrior to bridge between cultures, now embodied the possibility that the frontier offered not just for individual reinvention, but for collective evolution towards something unprecedented. In official territorial planning, the drums that Kokosi had heard during his escape now marked celebrations rather than warnings. Their rhythm spoke of connection rather than division, of shared purpose rather than isolated struggle, of future possibility rather than past trauma. Standing at the threshold of the community meeting house built on the site of her destroyed cabin, Rebecca understood completely how pulling one injured child from the river had catalyzed transformation, extending far beyond any single life's boundaries. 43 children were rescued, a trafficking network exposed, multiple communities united against shared threats, a region's approach to frontier challenges fundamentally altered, all stemming from one woman's choice to help rather than ignore, to risk rather than retreat, to cooperate rather than isolate. The moral of their story emerged not through abstract principle, but lived demonstration that compassion motivated action, but community sustained change. Individual courage initiated response, but collective commitment achieved lasting victory. As darkness gathered outside the warm meeting house, Rebecca heard distant drums joining local celebration, not threat approaches, but welcoming calls. From allied settlements marking their own achievements in cooperative ventures sparked by the Salt Creek rescue and its aftermath. The frontier's future was being written through such connections, one transformed relationship at a time, one successful collaboration replacing previous suspicion, one shared story inspiring others to choose alliance over isolation when crisis demanded response beyond individual capability. Rebecca Morrison smiled at the sound, understanding finally that the drums had always been calling for community. They simply needed people willing to answer with courage sufficient for building bridges rather than walls, for extending hands rather than raising barriers, for choosing shared transformation over comfortable separation. The story of Kokosi's rescue had ended, but the larger narrative of frontier community building through cooperative resistance continued expanding across territories where people recognized that some challenges demanded collective response regardless of traditional boundaries, and in communities stretching toward the horizon, children played safely because adults had learned that true strength emerged not from individual isolation, but from networks of mutual support extending across every division that history, culture, or fear might have previously imposed. The drums echoed, carrying messages of a successful community defending its most vulnerable members through coordinated effort. But their deeper rhythm announced something unprecedented in frontier tradition: the transformation of scattered survival into intentional society where protection flowed naturally from connection rather than separation. Rebecca Morrison had answered their call, but the response had always been waiting within community members willing to recognize that their highest safety lay in shared responsibility rather than defended isolation. The frontier had taught them well about individual strength, but crisis had revealed that collective wisdom offered their children's only genuine security. The drums continued, their message clear across distances that no longer divided, but now connected communities, learning that true frontier wisdom meant building together what no one could maintain alone. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.